Chapter 1. By the age of 63, Frank Bickerstaff had become an expert at recognizing the difference between being retired and being finished, and the distinction was not nearly as obvious as people imagined. When he first left the accounting firm 18 months earlier, retirement had felt like a reward he had spent 4 decades earning. Friends had congratulated him. Former clients had shaken his hand and told him how lucky he was. For a while, he believed them. He slept later than he used to. He drank coffee on the back deck overlooking the lake behind his small house. He read books that had been sitting untouched on his shelves for years. He took long walks around town and occasionally stopped to chat with neighbors he had previously only waved at while hurrying off to work. For 6 months, it felt wonderful. Then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, the novelty wore away. The problem was not that Frank lacked hobbies. The garage was full of hobbies. There was a fishing rod expensive enough to suggest a level of commitment he had never actually possessed. There were woodworking tools purchased during an optimistic phase that had lasted approximately 3 weekends. There were stacks of books, boxes of old photographs, unfinished household projects, and enough supplies to keep a moderately enthusiastic retiree occupied for years. The problem was that none of those things had ever truly been the point. What Frank missed was having something to figure out. He missed being presented with a puzzle that somebody else couldn't solve. For most of his career, people had brought him financial mysteries disguised as accounting problems. Numbers didn't lie, no matter how hard people tried to persuade them otherwise, and Frank had always enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of untangling a mess until the truth revealed itself. Lately, there had been very little truth left to untangle. On the rainy Wednesday morning when everything began, Frank found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and a documentary playing quietly on television in the next room. The documentary concerned municipal wastewater systems, a fact that would have horrified his younger self but barely registered anymore. Outside, low clouds drifted over the lake and reduced the world to muted shades of gray. The scene was peaceful enough, but Frank had begun to suspect that peace and boredom were close relatives. When the phone rang, he almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, that would have been enough to send the call directly to voicemail. Retirement, however, had subtly altered his standards. A man with a busy schedule ignored unknown callers. A man contemplating a documentary about sewer infrastructure occasionally answered them. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Doris McPhee. Within 5 minutes, she had informed him that she was recently divorced, recently retired, and currently investigating what she believed to be a conspiracy operating inside the town. Frank listened politely, assuming he had somehow become trapped in the wrong conversation. By the time she asked if he would meet her for coffee, his curiosity had overcome his skepticism, not because he believed anything she was saying. Quite the opposite. He was fascinated by the possibility that somebody could sound so intelligent while describing something that appeared, on the surface at least, completely absurd. An hour later, he found himself sitting across from her in the lakeside cafe, wondering whether he had made a mistake. Doris McPhee was not what he had expected. Conspiracy theorists, at least the ones portrayed on television, generally looked exhausted or agitated or slightly unhinged. Doris looked like a retired principal preparing to explain why your excuses were inadequate. Her silver hair was neatly trimmed, her posture was perfect, and her expression suggested she had spent much of her life being the smartest person in a room and was rarely disappointed by the results. For several minutes, they talked about ordinary things: the weather, retirement, rising grocery prices, the closure of a hardware store on the edge of town. Frank began to wonder whether he had misunderstood the purpose of the meeting altogether. Then Doris leaned forward slightly and said, in the calm tone of somebody introducing a perfectly reasonable topic, "The town is being managed by a secret organization." Frank stared at her. Not because the statement was shocking. People said strange things all the time. What surprised him was the confidence with which she delivered it. There was no drama in her voice, no excitement. She sounded like a woman discussing property taxes. When Frank asked who exactly was managing the town, Doris admitted she didn't know. When he asked what the organization was called, she admitted she didn't know that either. This, Frank pointed out, created certain challenges from an investigative standpoint. Doris acknowledged the problem but appeared entirely unconcerned by it. "The point isn't who they are," she explained. "The point is that they're there." What followed was one of the strangest conversations Frank had experienced in years. Most conspiracy theories involved grand claims, secret governments, hidden technologies, aliens, financial cabals. Doris's theory was different. Her evidence consisted almost entirely of things that worked. Road repairs happened before potholes became dangerous. Public gardens remained suspiciously well maintained. Lost pets were reunited with owners faster than seemed statistically reasonable. Community projects finished ahead of schedule. Infrastructure failures were resolved before they became crises. Small problems seemed to disappear before most residents even became aware they existed. Frank listened as she laid out her case and found himself increasingly amused by the underlying complaint. The town, according to Doris, was simply too competent. Under normal circumstances, he would have laughed the idea away immediately. Yet, as she continued talking, he found himself remembering dozens of small incidents he had barely noticed over the years. The playground equipment that had somehow been repaired overnight. The traffic light that had been fixed before anyone had filed a formal complaint. The shoreline cleanup that appeared to organize itself every spring without anybody being quite sure who organized it. None of it proved anything. Individually, each example was perfectly explainable. Taken together, however, they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss completely. Eventually, Doris slid a thick manila folder across the table. Frank opened it expecting chaos. Instead, he found organization, meticulous organization. Newspaper clippings had been sorted chronologically. Municipal reports were highlighted and cross-referenced. Names appeared repeatedly throughout the material. Certain addresses surfaced again and again. There were charts, notes, timelines, and, much to Frank's surprise, several remarkably competent spreadsheets. That discovery impressed him more than he cared to admit. As he flipped through the pages, something unexpected happened. He stopped wondering whether Doris was crazy and started wondering whether she might be onto something. Not because the evidence was convincing. It wasn't. But because it was interesting. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, Frank felt the familiar stirrings of a puzzle taking shape. There was a pattern hidden somewhere inside the material. He wasn't yet sure whether the pattern pointed toward a conspiracy, a misunderstanding, or simply the unintended consequences of too many retirees having too much free time. But he wanted to know. That realization annoyed him. He had no intention of becoming an investigator. He certainly had no intention of investigating conspiracies on behalf of recently divorced strangers. Yet by the time he left the cafe that afternoon with Doris's folder tucked under one arm, he already knew he was going to examine every page. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the streets shining beneath a pale patch of afternoon sunlight. As Frank walked toward his car, he experienced a feeling he had not felt since leaving his accounting career behind. He had something to do tomorrow. And somewhere across town, in the basement of an aging church where coffee was brewing and a dozen retirees were discussing community maintenance priorities, several members of the Committee for Normal Things would soon learn that a curious former accountant named Frank Bickerstaff had begun asking questions. Questions, they all agreed, had a habit of becoming problems. Chapter 2. Frank Bickerstaff fully expected the mystery to collapse under scrutiny. In fact, one of the reasons he found himself enjoying the assignment so much was that he assumed there wasn't actually anything to find. Doris McPhee had assembled a remarkably thorough collection of observations, newspaper clippings, municipal reports, photographs, and handwritten notes. But Frank's experience had taught him that impressive organization and factual accuracy were not necessarily the same thing. During 40 years in accounting, he had met plenty of intelligent people who could build elaborate theories around incomplete information. Human beings were remarkably good at connecting dots. Unfortunately, they were equally good at drawing lines between dots that had absolutely nothing to do with one another. His plan was simple. He would spend a few days reviewing Doris's material, identify where her assumptions had gone wrong, and return the folder with a polite explanation. The assignment would provide a welcome distraction from retirement. Doris would receive an honest answer, and everybody could move on with their lives. Instead, 3 days later, Frank found himself sitting at his kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, staring at a spreadsheet that had somehow grown to 7 tabs. This was generally not a sign that a project was becoming less interesting. The lake behind his house remained hidden beneath a layer of morning fog. His coffee had gone cold 20 minutes earlier, but he hadn't noticed. That happened sometimes when he became absorbed in a problem. His attention narrowed. The rest of the world faded into the background. Time became strangely elastic. An hour could disappear without warning. The habit had occasionally frustrated former girlfriends, although several had admitted it was one of the reasons they liked him in the first place. Frank was never happier than when he was trying to make sense of something that didn't quite make sense. The problem wasn't that Doris's evidence proved the existence of a conspiracy. It didn't. The problem was that the evidence refused to fit neatly into any other explanation either. The more he organized her material, the more a pattern emerged. Not a dramatic pattern, nothing that would convince a police detective or investigative journalist. Certainly nothing that would justify the kind of conclusions Doris had already reached. Yet there was something undeniably unusual about the sheer number of small problems that seemed to solve themselves around town. Road repairs were completed unusually quickly, public facilities were maintained unusually well, community events attracted volunteers with unusual consistency. Minor crises often disappeared before they became major ones. Individually, none of those facts meant very much. Together, they created a statistical profile that Frank found increasingly difficult to ignore. As accountants often discover, interesting mysteries rarely begin with what stands out. They begin with what doesn't. What bothered Frank was not the presence of unusual events. It was the absence of expected failures. Every organization, whether public or private, accumulated delays, backlogs, complaints, oversights, and inefficiencies. It was simply the nature of human systems. Yet this particular town seemed to experience fewer of them than comparable communities. Not dramatically fewer, just enough fewer to raise questions. Questions, unfortunately, were Frank's weakness. By the end of the week, he had started visiting town hall. The staff knew him by sight. Small-town familiarity had a way of surviving retirement. For nearly 4 decades, Frank had prepared financial statements, tax filings, and business analyses for a substantial portion of the local population. Even people who had never been his clients often recognized him from somewhere. When he began requesting maintenance records and project reports, nobody seemed particularly concerned. Retired accountants, after all, were expected to develop eccentric hobbies. If anyone found his sudden fascination with municipal infrastructure unusual, they were polite enough not to mention it. What Frank discovered during those visits only deepened the mystery. Projects routinely finished ahead of schedule. Not always, not even most of the time, but often enough to stand out. Delays occurred, yet somehow the consequences of those delays rarely seemed severe. Public complaints existed, but they were generally resolved before growing into larger problems. Looking through years of records, Frank repeatedly encountered situations that should have become messy and expensive but somehow remained manageable. One afternoon, he carried a stack of photocopies to a diner across the street from town hall and spent 2 hours comparing maintenance schedules while eating a sandwich he barely tasted. By the time he finished, several neighboring municipalities had become involuntary participants in his analysis. Their records were publicly available online, and Frank had started building comparison tables. The results were intriguing, not conclusive, but intriguing. The town consistently performed a little better than expected, a little faster, a little smoother, a little more competently. The differences were small enough that nobody would notice them casually. Yet Frank's entire professional life had been built around noticing small differences. A 1% discrepancy could reveal an accounting error. A slightly unusual trend could expose a larger problem. Tiny deviations often mattered more than dramatic ones. That realization followed him everywhere. During walks around the lake, he found himself studying projects he would previously have ignored. A repaired section of shoreline trail, a recently restored park bench, fresh paint on a community building. None of it seemed remarkable until he began asking himself the same question repeatedly. Who actually did this? The official answers were often vague. volunteers, community groups, local initiatives, partnerships. Helpful descriptions, perhaps, but not particularly specific ones. One afternoon, he stopped beside a section of walking trail where a handrail appeared to have been recently repaired. An elderly man in work clothes was tightening bolts and adjusting brackets with the quiet concentration of somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. Frank watched for a few moments before striking up a conversation. The man was friendly enough. He talked about the weather, the lake, the upcoming tourist season. When Frank asked whether he worked for the town, however, the answer became unexpectedly slippery. "Not exactly," the man said. "Volunteer? Something like that." The response wasn't suspicious. It was simply imprecise. Frank had spent years interviewing business owners. He knew the difference between somebody avoiding a question and somebody answering it loosely. This felt like the latter. The man wasn't hiding anything. He simply didn't seem interested in defining his role. The encounter lingered in Frank's mind long afterward, not because it was important, but because it fit the growing pattern. Everywhere he looked, he found capable retired people quietly solving problems that technically belonged to nobody and everybody at the same time. A few days later, Doris called. She had developed 3 new theories since their last conversation. One involved storm drains, another involved flower beds, the third involved what she described as a statistically impossible dog recovery network. Frank listened patiently. Over the course of their conversations, he had learned that Doris possessed a remarkable gift for noticing unusual details and an equally remarkable talent for drawing conclusions that extended several miles beyond the available evidence. It was an oddly useful combination. Most of her theories were nonsense. Many of her observations were excellent. As she spoke, Frank glanced toward his computer screen where a list of recurring names remained open. That list represented the most interesting discovery he had made so far. The same individuals appeared repeatedly throughout the records: a retired engineer, a former librarian, an insurance adjuster, a school administrator, a former public works supervisor. None held official authority, none occupied leadership positions. Yet their names surfaced again and again around successful community projects, volunteer initiatives, infrastructure improvements, and problem-solving efforts. The pattern was subtle enough that nobody else would likely notice it. Frank, however, had spent most of his life noticing exactly this sort of thing. When he finally hung up with Doris, he sat quietly for several minutes looking at the names. Outside, the afternoon sunlight shimmered across the lake. A pair of kayakers moved slowly along the shoreline. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower droned in the distance. It was a perfectly ordinary day. Yet for the first time since retiring, Frank felt the pleasant sensation of standing at the edge of something larger than himself. Whether that something turned out to be a conspiracy, a misunderstanding, or simply an unusual collection of exceptionally competent retirees remained to be seen. What mattered was that the puzzle was real. And the more he examined it, the more convinced he became that somebody in town was paying very close attention to problems before they became problems. The question he could no longer stop asking himself was why. Chapter 3. By the second week of what he still refused to call an investigation, Frank Bickerstaff had developed a routine. He would wake up a little earlier than necessary, make coffee, sit at the kitchen table overlooking the lake, and spend an hour reviewing whatever information he had gathered the previous day. After that, he would usually take a walk through town, partly for exercise and partly because he had discovered that people tended to reveal far more information when they believed a conversation was casual. The remainder of the day was spent following whatever thread currently held his attention. It was not an efficient system, but then efficiency had never been the point. Retirement had finally given him the luxury of pursuing questions without needing to justify the time. The surprising part was how much he was enjoying himself. For nearly 2 years he had been drifting through his days with the vague feeling that something was missing. Friends had told him he needed hobbies. Former co-workers had recommended travel. One particularly enthusiastic neighbor had spent months trying to convince him to join a pickleball league. Frank had experimented with all of it and discovered that none of it solved the underlying problem. What he missed was engagement. He missed having something to think about when he woke up in the morning. He missed the feeling that there was a problem waiting to be solved. Now there was. The problem happened to involve a possible secret organization composed almost entirely of senior citizens, which was not where he had expected retirement to take him, but life rarely consulted him before making decisions. The list of names on his computer had grown steadily over the previous several days. Every time he reviewed a community project, volunteer initiative, maintenance effort, or local news story, the same handful of individuals appeared somewhere in the background. Rarely in leadership positions. Rarely quoted in newspaper articles. Rarely receiving recognition. Yet they were there often enough to attract attention. Walter Pike, Evelyn Marsh, Howard Bell, Ruth Carmichael, Glenn Cartwright. Several others had joined the list as well, though these names appeared most frequently. Frank had spent enough years working with data to recognize when repetition stopped being coincidence and started becoming a pattern. The obvious next step was to learn who these people actually were. That turned out to be surprisingly easy. Small towns contained very few secrets, at least the ordinary kind. The challenge was rarely obtaining information. The challenge was sorting useful information from the enormous volume of stories, opinions, rumors, and half-remembered anecdotes that accumulated around every long-term resident. Walter Pike, for example, had spent nearly 40 years as a civil engineer before retiring. According to 3 different people, he was either brilliant, stubborn, impossible to work with, or all 3 simultaneously. Evelyn Marsh had served as head librarian for almost 3 decades and appeared to know every resident in town along with their parents, children, and reading habits. Howard Bell had worked in insurance claims and possessed what one former colleague described as an almost supernatural ability to identify problems before they happened. Ruth Carmichael had been a school administrator who somehow remained involved in community activities despite having retired nearly 10 years earlier. Individually, none of these biographies seemed unusual. Collectively, however, they began creating an interesting picture. Frank noticed the same characteristic appearing again and again. Competence. Not ambition, not influence, not wealth. Competence. Every individual on the list had spent a career solving practical problems. Engineers, administrators, planners, managers, coordinators, supervisors. These were not people who sought attention. They were people who made things work. The observation followed him one afternoon while he sat in the lakeside cafe reviewing notes. The lunch crowd had mostly dispersed. Rain tapped softly against the front windows, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room. Frank had spread several documents across the table and was comparing names when Doris McPhee arrived carrying enough energy for 3 people. She slid into the chair opposite him and immediately began examining the papers. "I knew it," she said. "You don't even know what you're looking at." "I know you're making progress." Frank smiled despite himself. Over the past 2 weeks, he had developed an unexpected appreciation for Doris. She was frequently wrong, occasionally exasperating, and entirely incapable of resisting dramatic conclusions. Yet she was also observant, intelligent, and far more enjoyable company than most people he encountered. "You remember Walter Pike?" he asked. "The engineer? You know him?" "Everybody knows Walter Pike." "Why?" Doris thought for a moment. "Because things improve when he's around." Frank paused. It was such an odd answer that he looked up from his notes. "What does that mean?" "I don't know exactly," Doris admitted. "It's just true." She considered the question further. 5 years ago, the marina was having drainage problems. Walter spent a few days looking at it, and suddenly the issue disappeared. A few years before that, there were complaints about traffic around the elementary school. Walter got involved somehow, and the problem went away. Nobody ever made a big deal about it. Frank made a note. Doris pointed at another name. "Evelyn's the same." "The librarian?" "Former librarian." "What about her?" Doris shrugged. "People ask Evelyn questions, then somehow solutions appear." Frank laughed. "That's not useful. It's accurate." "What exactly does she do?" "No idea." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, and by the time it ended, Frank realized something interesting. Nobody described these individuals in terms of authority. People never said Walter made decisions. They said he solved problems. They never said Evelyn was influential. They said she knew people. Nobody talked about power. They talked about usefulness. The distinction seemed important. That evening, Frank found himself driving toward the community center on the edge of town after noticing several names from his list associated with a volunteer maintenance project taking place there. His original intention was simply to observe. Observation was safe. Observation did not require awkward conversations. Unfortunately, circumstances had other plans. The moment he arrived, somebody handed him a paintbrush. Before he fully understood what was happening, he was helping repaint a storage building. An hour later, he found himself standing beside Walter Pike. The engineer was older than Frank had expected, somewhere in his 70s, with a weathered face and the calm demeanor of someone who had long ago stopped feeling the need to impress anybody. For a while they worked in silence. Then Walter nodded toward the paintbrush. "You're holding it wrong." Frank glanced down. "I didn't realize there was a correct way." "There is," Walter demonstrated. Frank reluctantly admitted the man was right. The conversation developed naturally after that. They discussed retirement, local businesses, construction projects, weather patterns, and the gradual decline of hardware stores. Walter was easy to talk to and surprisingly funny. Most importantly, he seemed completely ordinary. Frank had expected something else. Not suspicious exactly, just more unusual. Instead, Walter reminded him of dozens of retired professionals he had known throughout his career. Practical, intelligent, mildly stubborn. Eventually, Frank steered the conversation toward community projects. Walter listened patiently, then smiled. "You've been asking questions." The statement caught Frank off guard. "A few." "So I've heard." Frank lowered his paintbrush. Something about the response made him pay closer attention. "Heard from who?" Walter's smile widened slightly. "Small town." That was not an answer. Unfortunately, it was also true. They continued working for another 20 minutes before Walter finally said something Frank would think about for days afterward. "You know what most people misunderstand about retirement?" Frank shook his head. "They think work is what they retire from." Walter dipped his brush into a paint tray. "The truth is that most people retire from getting paid. They don't retire from caring." The remark hung in the air, simple, almost obvious, yet unexpectedly profound. Frank found himself thinking about it all the way home. The next morning he reviewed his notes again while drinking coffee beside the lake. The fog had finally lifted. Sunlight danced across the water. A fishing boat moved slowly along the far shoreline. On his screen sat a growing network of names, connections, projects, and observations. None of it resembled a conspiracy, at least not the kind Doris imagined. Nobody appeared to be controlling the town. Nobody seemed interested in power. Nobody was getting rich. The deeper Frank looked, the more the pattern resembled something else entirely. A collection of highly capable people who continued solving problems long after retirement. The idea should have ended the investigation. In some ways, it explained everything. Yet one question remained unanswered. If these people were simply helpful retirees, why did they all seem connected to one another? That question lingered in Frank's mind throughout the morning. By lunchtime, it had become impossible to ignore. By mid-afternoon, he was searching through community records again. And by evening, he discovered something that made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen. 3 years earlier, 5 of the names on his list had attended the same meeting. 2 years earlier, several had appeared together at another event. Then another, then another. The gatherings were infrequent, easy to overlook, yet undeniably real. The same people, the same pattern. Repeated again and again. For the first time since opening Doris McPhee's folder, Frank felt a genuine surge of excitement. Because whether they were running a conspiracy or not, the suspiciously competent people clearly knew each other. And if they knew each other, there was a very good chance they were meeting somewhere. The challenge now was figuring out where, and perhaps more importantly, why. Chapter 4. Frank Bickerstaff's investigation took an unexpected turn the morning a park bench disappeared. The fact that he even noticed the disappearance would have surprised the version of himself that existed 2 months earlier. At that time, he would have walked through Lakeside Park without giving the matter a second thought. Public benches came and went. Municipal maintenance crews replaced things. Wood rotted, metal rusted, life continued. The disappearance of a piece of outdoor furniture would not have qualified as noteworthy. Unfortunately, Frank was no longer looking at the town the way he once had. Ever since Doris McPhee had handed him her folder of observations, he had developed a habit of noticing things that previously blended into the background. It wasn't that the town had changed. The town was exactly the same as it had always been. What had changed was his attention. Once you started looking for patterns, you discovered patterns everywhere. Most of them meant nothing. The challenge was determining which ones mattered. The call from Doris arrived shortly after breakfast. Frank recognized her number immediately. Over the previous several weeks, she had developed an impressive ability to contact him at precisely the moment he sat down with a fresh cup of coffee. "Something happened," she announced. Frank looked out the kitchen window toward the lake. The morning was calm. The water reflected a pale blue sky. Nothing appeared to be happening anywhere. "Good morning, Doris." "The bench is gone." Frank waited. "The bench in Lakeside Park." Another pause. Then Frank said, "I feel like I'm missing part of the story." Doris sighed heavily, the way teachers often do when confronted by disappointing students. "The point is that it wasn't supposed to disappear." "What makes you think that?" "Because I checked." Frank had long ago stopped asking how Doris acquired information. She possessed the investigative instincts of a determined newspaper reporter combined with the available free time of a retired woman who no longer had anyone telling her to mind her own business. Over the next several minutes, she explained that no maintenance request had been filed, no replacement project had been announced, and nobody she spoke with seemed to know where the bench had gone. To Frank, this sounded mildly unusual. To Doris, it sounded like the opening chapter of a conspiracy. The difference between those interpretations was becoming a familiar feature of their relationship. Nevertheless, the bench intrigued him enough to visit the park later that morning. The empty space where it had once stood was easy to find. The concrete pad remained. The mounting hardware remained. Everything else was gone. Several people walked through the park while Frank examined the site, none of them appearing particularly concerned by the absence. One woman sat on a nearby rock and read a novel. A man walked his dog along the shoreline. 2 teenagers rode bicycles through the parking lot. The world continued functioning despite the loss of municipal seating. Yet as Frank stood there looking at the empty concrete pad, he found himself thinking less about the bench and more about the people whose names continued appearing throughout his investigation. Walter Pike, Evelyn Marsh, Howard Bell, Ruth Carmichael. The increasingly familiar collection of retirees seemed connected to almost every example Doris had uncovered. Not directly, not officially. They never appeared as leaders or decision-makers. Instead, they existed at the edges of events, like supporting characters who somehow kept appearing in every chapter. The missing bench became interesting because it offered another opportunity to observe them. Over the next several days, Frank made inquiries, though inquiries was perhaps too formal a word. He asked questions while drinking coffee. He asked questions during walks. He asked questions while standing in line at the grocery store. One of the advantages of retirement was that conversations no longer needed a purpose. People talked more freely when they believed you were simply making conversation. The answers proved surprisingly inconsistent. The town hadn't removed the bench. The Parks Department hadn't scheduled repairs. No contractor had been hired. No replacement had been ordered. At the same time, nobody seemed especially concerned. The reaction struck Frank as odd. If a public asset disappeared unexpectedly, somebody usually complained. Somebody usually became annoyed. Somebody usually demanded answers. Instead, the prevailing response appeared to be mild curiosity mixed with confidence that the situation would somehow resolve itself. The most revealing conversations occurred with Walter Pike and Evelyn Marsh. Frank encountered Walter at the hardware store while examining garden tools he had no intention of purchasing. The two men talked for nearly 20 minutes about everything except the subject Frank actually wanted to discuss: retirement, weather patterns, local construction projects, the declining quality of power tools, and the regrettable tendency of hardware stores to become less useful every year all received considerable attention before Frank finally mentioned the missing bench. Walter's reaction lasted only a moment. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The expression crossed his face and disappeared almost immediately, but Frank noticed it. The same thing happened when he later spoke with Evelyn. She didn't seem concerned. She seemed informed. That distinction occupied Frank's thoughts for the rest of the week. By Friday evening, he found himself driving past Lakeside Park shortly before sunset. He had no specific reason for being there beyond curiosity. The investigation, if it could still be called that, had increasingly become an excuse to wander through town looking for pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its full shape. As he approached the park, however, he noticed several vehicles parked near the shoreline. Nothing unusual about that. What caught his attention was the group of people gathered nearby. Most appeared to be retirees. Several were familiar. Walter was there. Evelyn was there. Howard Bell stood beside a pickup truck talking to two other members of Frank's growing list of suspiciously competent people. The gathering itself looked remarkably ordinary. There were no secret handshakes, no coded messages, no shadowy meetings. Instead, the group appeared to be engaged in the sort of practical activity that retired people often found themselves doing. They were repairing the bench. Frank remained standing for several moments, simply watching the scene unfold. The missing bench had not been stolen. It had not vanished. It had not become evidence in a larger conspiracy. It had been quietly removed, disassembled, sanded, repaired, painted, and prepared for reinstallation by a collection of retirees who apparently considered preventative maintenance a recreational activity. The realization should have been disappointing. Instead, it was oddly charming. The group worked with the efficiency of people who had spent decades solving practical problems. Nobody seemed to be in charge, yet everyone appeared to know what needed to be done. Tools moved where they were required. Materials appeared at the appropriate moments. Conversations flowed easily between work tasks. The atmosphere reminded Frank of successful project teams he had encountered throughout his career, except these individuals no longer had budgets, deadlines, performance reviews, or organizational charts. What they had instead was experience, an enormous amount of experience. Eventually, Walter noticed him standing nearby and waved him over. No dramatic confrontation followed. Nobody appeared concerned that Frank had been asking questions. In fact, several members of the group seemed amused by it. The explanation proved remarkably straightforward. The bench had been deteriorating for years. Replacing it later would cost significantly more than repairing it now. The town's maintenance schedule was already overloaded. Rather than wait for the problem to worsen, the group had simply decided to solve it themselves. The solution was so practical that Frank almost felt embarrassed for expecting anything more complicated. Yet, as the evening progressed, he realized the bench itself was not the important part of the story. The important part was the organization required to make something like this happen. Somebody had noticed the problem. Somebody had arranged the materials. Somebody had coordinated the work. Somebody had assembled the volunteers. The process appeared effortless only because experienced people had spent years learning how to make difficult things look easy. As the sun settled lower over the lake and the restored bench gradually took shape, Frank found himself less interested in the project than in the people surrounding it. These were not activists. They were not politicians. They were not busybodies searching for recognition. If anything, they seemed actively uninterested in receiving credit. What connected them was competence, the same quality he had been noticing since the beginning. They were people who saw problems and instinctively moved toward them. People who knew how things worked. People who had spent entire careers making systems function. Standing there beside the water, watching the final pieces come together, Frank experienced a realization that would remain with him long afterward. Doris had been wrong about the conspiracy, at least partly. There was no evidence that a secret group controlled the town. What clearly existed, however, was something else. A network, a community, a collection of highly capable retirees who seemed to know one another remarkably well, and who possessed an unusual habit of quietly solving problems before most residents even became aware those problems existed. The mystery, Frank now understood, was not whether these people existed. The mystery was how they were organized. Because nobody accidentally coordinated this many capable individuals for this many years. Something connected them, and sooner or later Frank intended to find out what it was. Chapter 5. In retrospect, Frank Bickerstaff would later realize that the mystery had largely been solved before he ever walked through the door of St. Andrew's Church. The evidence had been sitting in front of him for weeks. He simply hadn't known how to interpret it. Like most people, Frank had spent much of his life assuming that influence flowed through official channels. Important things happened because important people made decisions. Governments acted, businesses acted, organizations acted, committees passed motions, boards approved budgets, bureaucracies issued instructions. Somewhere, someone was always in charge. The older he became, however, the more he began noticing a different reality. Much of daily life functioned because ordinary people quietly stepped forward whenever something needed doing. The playground got repaired because a retired carpenter noticed a problem. The charity fundraiser succeeded because someone spent 3 weeks making phone calls nobody else wanted to make. The community garden survived because a handful of volunteers continued showing up every Saturday morning long after the initial enthusiasm faded. Those people rarely received much attention. Their names seldom appeared in newspapers. They rarely occupied positions of authority. Most communities simply assumed they would always be there. The people Frank had been investigating seemed to belong to that category. The difficulty was that they appeared to belong to it in unusually large numbers. The realization settled over him gradually during the days following the bench restoration. He found himself thinking less about conspiracies and more about competence. Again and again, he encountered individuals who had spent entire careers solving practical problems and who seemed unwilling to stop simply because retirement had arrived. Engineers continued thinking like engineers. Administrators continued organizing things. Teachers continued helping people. Accountants continued looking for inefficiencies. Whatever skills had defined them during their working lives had apparently followed them into retirement. Perhaps that should not have been surprising. A person could stop collecting a paycheck. A person could stop commuting to an office. A person could stop attending meetings. What they could not easily do was stop being themselves. That thought occupied Frank's mind one rainy afternoon while he sat in the lakeside cafe looking out at the lake. The spring weather had entered one of its familiar moods where sunshine and rain seemed unable to agree on who was responsible for the day. Patches of blue sky drifted across the water only to disappear behind fresh clouds a few minutes later. The result was a landscape that never seemed entirely settled, and Frank found himself feeling much the same way. The investigation had reached an awkward stage. He no longer believed Doris's theory, at least not the version she preferred. There was no evidence that a secret organization controlled the town. Nobody appeared interested in power. Nobody appeared to be making money. Nobody appeared to be manipulating anything. Yet the pattern remained. The same names, the same faces, the same remarkably capable people appearing whenever a problem was solved. At times he felt as though he had assembled 9/10 of a puzzle while the final piece remained hidden under the table. That missing piece arrived, as so many things seemed to, through Doris. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Frank was attempting to convince himself that cleaning out the garage qualified as a productive use of time. "I think I found where they meet." Frank set down a dusty box of extension cords. "Who meets?" "The people you've been investigating." Frank smiled despite himself. Doris had become part client, part partner, and part source of entertainment over the past several weeks. Her theories continued arriving at roughly the same rate as weather forecasts, and they varied considerably in accuracy. Still, she occasionally noticed things worth paying attention to. This appeared to be one of them. Over the course of the conversation, She explained that several individuals from Frank's list had been seen arriving at St. Andrew's Church on the same evening each month. Nothing particularly suspicious about that, of course. Churches contained meetings the way lakes contained fish. Yet enough familiar names appeared in connection with the gathering that Frank's curiosity was immediately engaged. What interested him most was not the possibility of a secret meeting. It was the possibility of finally seeing the network assembled in one place. For weeks he had been examining fragments. Individual people, individual projects, individual stories. Perhaps for the first time he would have an opportunity to observe the entire picture. The following Tuesday evening arrived cool and clear after several days of rain. As Frank drove across town, the setting sun reflected off wet pavement and transformed ordinary streets into ribbons of gold. The church itself stood on a quiet residential block lined with mature maple trees. It was the sort of building most people stopped noticing after living in town for a few years. Familiarity had rendered it nearly invisible. Several vehicles occupied the parking lot. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. In fact, the entire scene seemed almost aggressively ordinary. Frank remained in his car for a minute or two, watching people arrive. He recognized several immediately: Walter Pike, Evelyn Marsh, Howard Bell, Ruth Carmichael. Others followed. Some carried notebooks. Some carried trays of baking. One man appeared to be transporting a coffee urn large enough to support a small military operation. Nobody looked secretive. Nobody looked conspiratorial. They looked exactly like retirees attending a community meeting. That realization made Frank laugh aloud. For weeks he had been chasing clues that increasingly resembled the activities of exceptionally organized grandparents. Eventually, curiosity overcame hesitation, and he made his way inside. The sound reached him before the room itself came into view. Conversation. Laughter. The clatter of folding chairs. Somebody discussing a drainage issue. Somebody else debating landscaping. The atmosphere felt less like a secret gathering and more like the beginning of a church supper. By the time Frank reached the basement level, several people had already noticed him. What surprised him most was not their reaction. It was the absence of any reaction at all. Nobody appeared shocked to see him. Nobody appeared concerned. Nobody looked as though he had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to find. Instead, the expressions he encountered seemed remarkably similar to those of people watching a guest finally arrive at a party after spending weeks trying to locate the address. Walter Pike rose from his chair and smiled. "There you are." The room chuckled softly. Not because Frank was being mocked. Because, as he would later discover, nearly everyone present had been aware of his investigation for some time. The realization should have embarrassed him. Instead, it somehow completed the picture. Of course they knew. Small towns operated on information. The committee's members probably knew more about local events than anyone in town. The idea that a retired accountant had been asking questions about them for over a month without attracting attention was ridiculous. Someone handed him coffee. Someone else found him a chair. Conversations resumed, and gradually, over the course of the next hour, Frank began to understand what he had actually discovered. The Committee for Normal Things was not an organization in any formal sense. There were no officers, no bylaws, no membership cards, and no strategic plans. In fact, many of the people present seemed uncomfortable with the word committee altogether. Yet the name persisted because it was close enough to the truth. What existed was a network, a remarkably effective network. The members met periodically to discuss what was happening around town. They shared information. They identified problems. They connected people. Sometimes they volunteered directly. Sometimes they simply knew who to call. Often the solution to a problem was not money or authority, but awareness. The right person learning about the right issue at the right time. Listening to them talk, Frank found himself thinking about the difference between knowledge and experience. Knowledge told you a trail was deteriorating. Experience told you which volunteer had access to equipment. Knowledge told you a community organization was struggling. Experience told you who had successfully solved the same problem 20 years earlier. Individually, none of these people seemed extraordinary. Collectively, they possessed hundreds of years of accumulated practical wisdom. That was the committee's true asset. Not power, not influence, experience. As the evening continued, story after story reinforced the same conclusion. A drainage issue addressed before spring flooding arrived. A volunteer organization connected with new leadership before it collapsed. A maintenance problem solved before replacement became necessary. Most of the successes shared a common characteristic. Nobody outside the room had noticed them, and that, Frank slowly realized, was exactly the point. The committee existed to prevent problems from becoming stories. Success looked like normal life. Success looked like a town functioning slightly better than expected. Success looked like nothing remarkable happening at all. When the meeting finally ended and people began stacking chairs and gathering jackets, Frank remained seated for several moments longer. Around him, conversations continued in small groups, while coffee cups disappeared into bins and leftover baking found new owners. The entire evening felt less like the discovery of a secret organization and more like the discovery of a forgotten civic institution that had somehow escaped formal recognition. As he drove home later that evening, the lake reflecting moonlight beside the road, he found himself thinking about something Walter had said several weeks earlier. Most people retired from getting paid. They didn't retire from caring. For the first time since leaving his accounting career, Frank understood exactly what that meant. And for the first time since opening Doris McPhee's folder, he realized that the mystery which had occupied so much of his attention was not really about the committee at all. The real mystery was whether there might still be a place for him within something like it. Chapter 6. The discovery of the Committee for Normal Things should have marked the end of Frank Bickerstaff's investigation. For several weeks he had followed clues, examined records, annoyed municipal employees, consumed alarming quantities of coffee, and gradually assembled a picture of what he believed was a hidden organization operating behind the scenes of local life. In a technical sense, he had succeeded. The mystery had been solved. The people he had been tracking existed. They met regularly. They shared information. They quietly improved the community in ways most residents never noticed. Case closed. The difficulty was that Frank found himself thinking about them constantly. That was an unfamiliar experience. During his years as an accountant, he had investigated countless problems: financial discrepancies, operational inefficiencies, inventory issues, forecasting mistakes. Once a solution was found, his interest generally disappeared. He enjoyed solving puzzles, but he rarely lingered over them afterward. The committee was different, perhaps because it wasn't really a puzzle. It was a collection of people. The more he reflected on the evening at St. Andrew's Church, the more fascinated he became by the idea that an entire network of retirees had managed to create something genuinely useful without anybody formally instructing them to do so. What struck him most was how natural it all seemed. Nobody had launched an initiative. Nobody had developed a strategic plan. Nobody had stood at a podium and declared a mission. The committee appeared to have evolved gradually over years, perhaps decades, as capable people discovered one another and developed habits of cooperation. The result resembled a highly effective organization, yet it lacked many of the characteristics people normally associated with organizations. There was no hierarchy, no budget, no office, no authority. What held it together was trust, experience, and a shared tendency to notice problems that others overlooked. Frank spent the following week attempting to return to ordinary retirement. The attempt failed almost immediately. He found himself wondering what the committee was discussing at any given moment. He found himself noticing maintenance issues during walks around town and mentally categorizing them according to which committee member might care. He found himself reading local news stories and imagining the conversations that would occur around the folding tables in the church basement. Most troubling of all, he found himself looking forward to the next meeting. The realization was mildly irritating. At 63 years old, he had successfully avoided joining clubs, organizations, associations, committees, boards, councils, societies, and every other form of voluntary group activity for most of his adult life. He valued independence. He enjoyed solitude. The fact that he was now developing a curiosity about a room full of retirees discussing drainage systems suggested something had gone profoundly wrong. Or perhaps profoundly right. He had not yet decided. The matter remained unresolved until a Tuesday morning in early June when the town's goose population declared war on civilization. The first reports appeared gradually. A complaint from a jogger near the lakeshore. A photograph posted online showing several particularly aggressive geese occupying a walking trail. A local resident describing an unpleasant encounter in a parking lot. Individually, the incidents seemed harmless enough. Canada geese had always lived around the lake. Residents were accustomed to them. Visitors found them charming. Unfortunately, the geese had apparently reached a different conclusion. By the middle of the week, the birds seemed to have developed a coordinated strategy aimed at maximizing inconvenience. Walking paths became contested territory. Public beaches accumulated extraordinary quantities of droppings. Several cyclists reported being chased. One unfortunate tourist found himself trapped inside a public washroom, while a territorial goose guarded the entrance. Frank first became aware of the situation during breakfast when Doris called. Normally he allowed her to speak uninterrupted for several minutes, before attempting to identify the actual issue hidden inside the conversation. Experience had taught him that this approach saved time. "Something's happening at the waterfront," she announced. "What kind of something?" "The geese." Frank buttered a piece of toast. "The geese. They're organizing." Frank closed his eyes. "They're not organizing." "Then explain why they're suddenly everywhere." "Because they're geese." "That's exactly what they want you to think." The conversation deteriorated from there. Yet later that afternoon, while walking near the lake, Frank reluctantly admitted that Doris had identified a genuine problem, even if her explanation remained questionable. The geese were indeed everywhere. Dozens occupied the shoreline, more clustered around pathways and public lawns. Several appeared to have selected key strategic positions near benches and picnic tables. Their numbers weren't unprecedented, but their visibility certainly was. Frank paused beside the marina and watched a family alter its route rather than pass through a particularly hostile section of grass. The lead goose stood motionless, observing the retreat with what Frank could only describe as satisfaction. By Thursday, the issue had become impossible to ignore. Local social media filled with photographs. The newspaper published a light-hearted article. Residents began exchanging stories. The entire town appeared to be discussing geese. That evening, Frank attended the committee meeting. He told himself he was merely observing. This was technically true. It was also true that he had arrived 15 minutes early. The discussion that evening covered several ordinary matters before eventually arriving at the subject currently dominating local conversation: the geese. Frank listened with growing amusement as members described recent encounters. One resident had been chased into a flower bed. Another had abandoned a fishing spot after repeated confrontations. A third claimed the birds had effectively seized control of a section of shoreline trail. The stories were delivered with the same seriousness engineers might apply to bridge construction. That was one of the things Frank enjoyed about the committee. No matter how small the issue, people approached it thoughtfully. Eventually, the conversation shifted away from anecdotes and towards solutions. What happened next fascinated him. Nobody attempted to dominate the discussion. Nobody delivered speeches. Nobody insisted their idea was best. Instead, the group collectively began examining the problem from multiple perspectives. Several members possessed experience in parks management. Others understood wildlife behavior. A former municipal planner discussed pedestrian traffic patterns. An educator described how public signage might influence behavior. Within 20 minutes, a practical plan had begun to emerge. The goal wasn't eliminating geese. The goal was reducing conflict. Certain sections of shoreline would be modified to discourage congregation. Volunteer cleanup efforts would focus on heavily used public areas. Educational signage would help visitors understand nesting behavior. Alternative feeding areas farther from pedestrian traffic would make certain locations less attractive. The proposal sounded remarkably reasonable. It also sounded remarkably achievable. Frank found himself watching the discussion less as an observer and more as an analyst. During his career, he had attended hundreds of meetings. Most consumed substantial amounts of time while producing very little. This gathering operated differently. People listened, information flowed freely, ideas improved as others contributed. Disagreements occurred without becoming personal. Most impressively, everyone seemed focused on solving the problem rather than receiving credit for solving it. As the meeting concluded and people gathered coats and coffee mugs, Walter Pike wandered over and settled into the chair beside Frank. "Interesting group," Walter said. Frank smiled. "That's one word for it. You looked thoughtful." "I was." Walter waited. Frank glanced around the room. The last few members were preparing to leave. Folding tables remained covered with notes, maps, and half-finished coffee cups. Through the church basement windows he could see the fading light of evening settling over town. "I spent 40 years in meetings," Frank said. "Most of them were terrible." Walter nodded. "So did I. This one wasn't." "No." Frank considered the room once more. "What happens now?" Walter looked surprised by the question. "About the geese?" "About all of it." Walter smiled. "People make a few calls. Somebody talks to parks. Somebody else organizes volunteers. Someone speaks with the marina. A few signs get designed. A couple of residents make suggestions. Then, if everything goes according to plan, nobody notices anything happened." The answer captured the entire philosophy of the committee. Success would not appear in headlines. No ribbon would be cut. No speeches would be delivered. The town would simply function a little better than it had the week before. As Frank drove home that evening, he found himself thinking about the distinction between recognition and usefulness. Much of modern life seemed organized around visibility. People wanted acknowledgement, attention, evidence that their efforts mattered. The members of the committee appeared motivated by something different. They cared about outcomes. The outcome was the point. If nobody knew who deserved credit, that was perfectly acceptable. The next morning, while drinking coffee beside the lake, Frank watched a pair of geese glide across the water near shore. They looked peaceful enough from a distance, though he suspected appearances could be deceiving. A week earlier he would have dismissed the entire situation as a minor nuisance. Now he found himself curious. Not about the birds, about the people preparing to solve the problem, and for the first time since retiring, he realized he was beginning to look forward to being part of something larger than his own routine. The thought arrived quietly, almost without his noticing. Yet once it appeared, it refused to leave. Frank Bickerstaff, lifelong independent thinker, reluctant joiner of groups, and enthusiastic avoider of committees, was beginning to suspect that the Committee for Normal Things might have room for one more member. The possibility should have worried him. Instead, to his considerable surprise, it felt rather nice. Chapter 7. If Frank Bickerstaff had been asked at any point during the previous 40 years whether he was the sort of person who joined committees, he would have answered with an immediate and unequivocal no. The answer would not have required reflection. It would not have required clarification. It would have emerged with the same certainty as his opinions regarding poorly maintained spreadsheets, excessive debt, or people who used 10 words when 3 would accomplish the same task. Frank had spent much of his life avoiding organized groups whenever possible. He attended necessary meetings because work required it. He participated in professional associations because clients expected it. He occasionally joined community initiatives because saying no would have been impolite. Yet the moment those obligations ended, he generally retreated back toward the quiet independence he preferred. For most of his adult life, that arrangement had suited him perfectly. The older he became, however, the more he began to suspect that independence and isolation were not quite the same thing. The distinction had never mattered very much when he was working. A career naturally supplied interaction. Clients called, co-workers visited. Problems arrived daily. Conversations happened whether you sought them out or not. Retirement changed the equation. The days became quieter. The phone rang less often. Entire weeks could pass without anything requiring his particular skills or experience. At first, the silence felt restful. Eventually, it became something else. Frank had not fully appreciated how much satisfaction he derived from being useful. The realization arrived gradually during the weeks following his introduction to the Committee for Normal Things. Nobody formally invited him to join. In fact, the committee did not appear to possess a process for joining anything. There were no applications, no membership requirements, no ceremonies. People simply showed up, participated, and became part of the group through repeated involvement. The arrangement struck Frank as both refreshingly practical and mildly dangerous. Practical because it eliminated bureaucracy. Dangerous because it made participation almost impossible to refuse. The goose situation provided a perfect example. Within days of the committee's discussion, small changes began appearing around town. New signs appeared near heavily used sections of shoreline. Volunteer cleanup efforts increased. Certain grassy areas were modified to make them less attractive gathering spots. Educational information appeared online explaining nesting behavior and territorial patterns. None of the changes attracted much attention individually, yet together they gradually reduced the conflict between residents and the increasingly ambitious goose population. What impressed Frank was not the result. It was the process. No central authority seemed to be directing events. Instead, dozens of small actions unfolded simultaneously. People called one another. Information moved through existing relationships. Problems were matched with individuals capable of addressing them. The entire system resembled a highly efficient organization, despite lacking many of the characteristics normally associated with organizations. As Frank observed the process, he found himself thinking about ecosystems. During his accounting career, he had often encountered businesses that depended entirely upon a single individual. Everything flowed through one decision-maker. Everything required approval. Everything bottlenecked around a central authority. Those systems functioned adequately until the day that person became unavailable. The committee operated differently. Knowledge was distributed, responsibility was distributed, initiative was distributed. People simply noticed what needed doing and acted accordingly. The approach was surprisingly resilient. It was also surprisingly difficult to analyze, which perhaps explained why Frank spent increasing amounts of time trying. One Tuesday afternoon, several weeks after the Great Goose Crisis had begun winding toward resolution, he arrived at the church basement carrying a laptop. The decision seemed innocent enough. Unfortunately, history suggests that whenever an accountant voluntarily introduces technology into a functioning social system, complications usually follow. The evening began normally. People chatted over coffee. Updates were shared. A discussion emerged regarding maintenance concerns at the marina. Another involved a community garden seeking additional volunteers. The atmosphere remained relaxed and familiar. At some point during the meeting, however, a conversation developed regarding project tracking. Specifically, nobody seemed entirely certain how many ongoing initiatives currently existed. Several members possessed partial information. Others remembered details. Collectively, the group appeared confident that everything was under control. Frank listened for nearly 20 minutes before finally reaching the limits of his self-restraint. It was a familiar sensation. The same feeling had appeared countless times throughout his career whenever he encountered a problem that could be solved with a spreadsheet. The challenge was that not everyone appreciated spreadsheets with the same enthusiasm. Most people viewed them as tools. Frank occasionally viewed them as a lifestyle. By the time the discussion concluded, he had already begun sketching ideas. Nothing elaborate, a simple system, project names, responsible contacts, status updates, relevant notes, the sort of organizational structure that would allow information to remain accessible without requiring anyone to memorize every detail. The proposal seemed entirely reasonable, to Frank at least. When he presented the idea the following week, the reaction was mixed, not hostile. Not resistant, mostly cautious. Walter Pike studied the sample printout as though examining an unfamiliar species. Evelyn Marsh appeared intrigued. Howard Bell looked concerned that the spreadsheet might eventually become self-aware and begin demanding authority. The discussion that followed occupied much of the evening and provided Frank with a valuable lesson regarding the committee. The members were not opposed to organization. Many had spent entire careers creating it. What they feared was complexity. Complexity had a habit of growing. A simple tracking system became a reporting process. A reporting process became administration. Administration became bureaucracy. Before long, people spent more time managing the system than solving the original problem. The concern was entirely reasonable. Frank found himself agreeing with much of it. At the same time, he couldn't help noticing how often information became fragmented. Projects occasionally overlapped. Conversations were repeated. Historical knowledge sometimes existed only in the memory of a single individual. Eventually, a compromise emerged. The committee's favorite solution: a modest system, simple enough to avoid becoming burdensome, useful enough to improve coordination. Frank volunteered to maintain it. The moment the words left his mouth, he realized what had happened. Several people smiled. Walter looked particularly pleased, not because the proposal had succeeded, because Frank had unknowingly crossed an invisible threshold. For weeks he had attended meetings as an observer, an interested outsider, someone studying the committee from a safe distance. Volunteering changed the relationship. Observers did not maintain project records. Participants did. The realization followed him home that evening. As he drove along the shoreline road, the setting sun cast long reflections across the lake while sailboats drifted slowly toward the marina. Summer had fully arrived now. The town felt busier. Tourists filled patios and walking paths. Gardens exploded with color. The familiar rhythm of seasonal life continued all around him. Yet Frank's attention remained focused elsewhere. He found himself thinking about purpose, not in a grand philosophical sense. In a practical sense, purpose was often discussed as though it involved dramatic achievements or life-changing ambitions. In reality, many of the most satisfying forms of purpose were considerably smaller: helping solve a problem, contributing to a project, applying experience in a useful way, feeling connected to something beyond one's immediate concerns. The committee seemed to understand this intuitively. Nobody there was trying to change the world. They were simply improving the small section of it they happened to inhabit. The following weeks passed quickly. Frank's modest tracking system gradually evolved into a useful tool. New projects appeared. Old projects concluded. Information became easier to share. Historical notes accumulated. Members occasionally contacted him with updates or questions. Without ever intending to do so, he became one of the people others consulted. The transition felt surprisingly natural. One afternoon, he was reviewing project notes at home when Doris called. She had not spoken with him for several days, which usually indicated she was developing a new theory. "You're one of them now." Frank smiled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're keeping records." "I've always kept records." "You're helping." "I've always helped." "You're attending meetings." Frank considered the accusation. The uncomfortable part was that she had a point. Doris seemed delighted by this realization. "I hired a detective," she said, "and somehow ended up creating a committee member." "That's not what happened." "It absolutely is." After hanging up, Frank sat quietly for several moments looking out at the lake. The observation amused him because it contained more truth than he wished to admit. Somewhere along the way, the investigation had stopped being an investigation. The committee was no longer the subject of his curiosity. It had become part of his life. That fact became fully apparent at the next meeting when Walter greeted him with a simple question. "Can you give us an update on the project list?" Nothing dramatic, nothing ceremonial, no official announcement, just a practical request. Yet as Frank opened his laptop and began summarizing ongoing projects, he experienced an unexpected feeling. Not pride exactly, not accomplishment, something quieter. The satisfaction of knowing he belonged in the room. And for a man who had spent much of his life standing slightly outside groups, observing rather than participating, that feeling turned out to be far more meaningful than he ever would have predicted. Chapter 8. For most of the summer, Frank Bickerstaff found himself enjoying a version of retirement he had not previously known was available. The change was subtle enough that he did not immediately recognize it. Nothing dramatic had occurred. He had not embarked on a new career. He had not reinvented himself. He had not discovered hidden talents or adopted an adventurous lifestyle involving mountain climbing, international travel, or competitive sailing. His days remained remarkably ordinary. He still drank coffee while looking out at the lake. He still took long walks through town. He still spent more time than was strictly necessary organizing information. The difference was that his days now connected to something beyond themselves. The Committee for Normal Things had a way of creating that effect. Problems appeared. Conversations followed. People shared information. Solutions emerged. Most of the work remained invisible to the wider community, which was exactly how everyone seemed to prefer it. The committee existed in a curious space between formal institutions and informal friendships. It wasn't an organization in the traditional sense, yet it accomplished many of the things organizations were supposed to accomplish. Looking back, Frank suspected the secret was that nobody involved was trying to build an organization. They were simply trying to help. The result was considerably more effective than many professionally managed systems he had encountered during his working life. By mid-July, Frank's project tracker had become a regular feature of committee meetings. Members initially teased him about it. Several continued referring to it as the Great Spreadsheet of Destiny, a title Howard Bell had coined after discovering that Frank maintained color-coded status indicators. Frank pretended to dislike the nickname. In reality, he was mildly pleased by it. The tracker itself remained intentionally simple. Current projects, contact information, ongoing concerns, notes regarding previous issues. It existed primarily to prevent the committee from forgetting things, which was increasingly valuable as new projects appeared. One problem solved often revealed another. A repaired walking trail might expose drainage concerns. A volunteer recruitment effort might uncover maintenance needs. Communities, Frank had discovered, behaved much like living organisms. Everything connected to everything else. The committee thrived because its members understood those connections. That understanding was what first drew Frank's attention to the proposed development. The matter appeared harmless when it initially surfaced. Most large problems did. A brief article appeared in the local newspaper describing a proposal from a development company based in the city. The company had purchased a substantial parcel of land along the northern shoreline, an area consisting primarily of forest, wetlands, and undeveloped waterfront. According to the article, the proposal included residential housing, retail space, walking paths, public access points, and various amenities intended to attract both permanent residents and tourists. The article was accompanied by an artist's rendering. Everything looked pleasant: sunlit pathways, happy families, tastefully landscaped public spaces, people carrying bicycles, people drinking coffee, people who appeared suspiciously delighted to be participating in urban planning. Frank glanced at the article during breakfast and thought little about it. An hour later, however, he received 3 emails regarding the same project. One came from Walter, one came from Evelyn, one came from Ruth. None contained strong opinions. All 3 contained the same sentence: "We should probably talk about this." That alone captured Frank's attention. The committee rarely reacted strongly to news articles. Most issues were discussed casually. Information was gathered. Perspectives were shared. Opinions emerged gradually. The fact that 3 experienced members independently reached the same conclusion suggested something worth examining. At the next meeting, the development occupied a larger portion of the evening than any topic Frank had yet witnessed. What struck him immediately was the tone. Nobody opposed development in principle. Many committee members openly acknowledged that the town needed housing. New residents supported local businesses. Economic growth created opportunities. Younger families helped sustain schools and community organizations. The discussion contained none of the reflexive hostility that often accompanied development debates. Instead, the concern centered on details, the sort of details most people overlooked. As the conversation unfolded, Frank noticed a pattern he had seen many times during his accounting career. Experienced people were asking questions that inexperienced people often failed to consider. What would happen to stormwater runoff? How would increased traffic affect existing infrastructure? What impact would construction have on nearby wetlands? Had utility requirements been fully assessed? Were population projections realistic? Would promised public access remain public over time? The questions arrived steadily, each one reasonable on its own. Collectively, however, they painted a more complicated picture than the newspaper article had suggested. Frank spent much of the evening listening. That had become one of the unexpected pleasures of the committee. He was surrounded by people who knew things, not abstract things, practical things, useful things, knowledge accumulated through decades of experience. Walter understood infrastructure, Evelyn understood local history, Ruth understood community dynamics. Howard possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify risks hiding inside optimistic projections. Each perspective added another layer. By the end of the meeting, Frank found himself far less confident about the proposal than he had been 2 hours earlier. The real shift occurred the following week. Evelyn arrived carrying several large binders. The sight alone generated concern. Nobody transported large binders without a reason. The binders contained historical records, maps, planning documents, environmental assessments, council reports dating back decades. As it turned out, the northern shoreline had been the subject of discussion for much longer than anyone realized. Several previous development proposals had failed, some for economic reasons, others because of environmental concerns, a few because they simply made no practical sense. As members reviewed the material, a different narrative gradually emerged. The land itself was unusually complicated. Wetlands extended farther than many modern maps indicated. Seasonal water patterns created flooding concerns. Infrastructure requirements would be significantly more expensive than promotional materials suggested. Most importantly, the area served as a natural buffer protecting portions of the shoreline from erosion. The implications became increasingly difficult to ignore. The project might still be viable. It might even be beneficial. But it was certainly not as straightforward as the developers claimed. Frank found himself growing uneasy. Not because he opposed development, because the proposal reminded him of business forecasts he had reviewed throughout his career. Whenever a presentation seemed unusually optimistic, experience suggested caution. The numbers might technically be accurate, yet important information often remained absent. A week later, he attended a public information session hosted by the development company. The event took place in the community center and attracted a substantial crowd. Display boards lined the walls. Representatives answered questions. Renderings showcased attractive buildings surrounded by mature trees and smiling residents. The presentation was polished, very polished, perhaps too polished. As Frank moved through the room, he noticed something interesting. Committee members had dispersed throughout the audience, not together, separately, each speaking with different people, each asking different questions. The behavior reminded him of investigators gathering information, not adversarial, not confrontational, simply thorough. Walter examined infrastructure plans. Evelyn reviewed historical references. Howard studied financial assumptions. Ruth spoke with residents. Nobody announced themselves as committee members. Nobody coordinated publicly. Yet they seemed to cover every angle. The realization fascinated Frank. For months he had viewed the committee primarily as a group that solved small problems: benches, walking trails, volunteer shortages, community events. The development revealed a different dimension. These people weren't merely fixing things. They were protecting things, protecting institutional knowledge, protecting historical memory, protecting the accumulated wisdom that often disappeared whenever communities forgot their own history. Driving home afterward, Frank found himself thinking about a phrase he had encountered years earlier while reviewing a corporate acquisition. Institutional memory. Most organizations possessed it. Most organizations also underestimated its value until it vanished. The committee functioned as the town's institutional memory. Collectively, its members remembered decades of decisions, successes, mistakes, and unintended consequences. They remembered why things existed, why certain choices had been made, why previous plans had succeeded or failed. That knowledge gave them an unusual perspective. And for the first time since joining, Frank began to suspect that the committee's true purpose extended beyond solving practical problems. The benches and walking trails mattered. The geese mattered. The community projects mattered. Yet beneath all of those activities lay something deeper. The members cared about continuity. They cared about preserving the things that made the town work. Sometimes that meant fixing a problem. Sometimes it meant preventing one. And occasionally, Frank now realized, it meant standing between a community and a mistake it might not recognize until years later. As August approached and discussions surrounding the development intensified, a quiet sense of concern settled over the committee. Nobody panicked. Nobody made dramatic predictions. Nobody declared war on developers. That simply wasn't their style. Instead, they gathered information. They asked questions. They compared records. They examined assumptions. They did what experienced people always did when confronted with uncertainty. They paid attention. For Frank, the change was profound. The investigation that had begun with a conspiracy theory about suspiciously efficient retirees had evolved into something entirely different. He had expected to uncover eccentric volunteers. What he discovered instead was a group of citizens serving as unofficial guardians of the community's collective knowledge. And for the first time, he began to understand why the committee had survived for so many years. Not because they repaired benches. Not because they organized volunteers. Not because they solved small problems. The committee endured because every town eventually needs people willing to remember what everyone else has forgotten. The proposed development, he suspected, was about to test that responsibility more than anything they had faced in a very long time. Chapter 9. The months Frank Bickerstaff spent working with the Committee for Normal Things taught him something that no business seminar, management textbook, or professional conference had ever managed to explain properly. Most people dramatically underestimate how much knowledge exists inside an ordinary community. They underestimate it because most of that knowledge is invisible. It doesn't appear in databases. It isn't documented in reports. It rarely exists in a form that can be easily transferred from one person to another. Instead, it resides in memory, in experience, in stories. It accumulates over decades as people solve problems, make mistakes, observe consequences, and gradually develop an understanding of how a place actually works. The proposed shoreline development brought all of that hidden knowledge into the open. By early September, public discussion had intensified considerably. Newspaper articles appeared regularly. Public meetings attracted large audiences. Social media discussions became increasingly energetic, which Frank had come to understand was often a warning sign rather than a positive development. The development company continued presenting an attractive vision of the future: additional housing, economic growth, expanded services, new investment. Many residents supported the proposal enthusiastically. Others opposed it just as enthusiastically. The committee, meanwhile, occupied a more complicated position. Nobody wanted to stop progress. Nobody wanted to prevent growth. What they wanted was clarity. The problem was that clarity required work. A great deal of work. Frank began noticing a subtle shift in the committee's activities. The usual projects continued, of course. Benches still required repairs. Volunteer organizations still needed assistance. Community events still demanded coordination. Yet increasingly, conversations returned to the development proposal. Maps appeared. Historical documents appeared. Old photographs emerged from attics and filing cabinets. Long-forgotten reports resurfaced. The process fascinated Frank because it resembled a large-scale audit. Throughout his accounting career, he had often encountered situations where an appealing story existed on the surface while a more complicated reality existed underneath. Successful investigations rarely depended upon discovering dramatic secrets. More often, they depended upon gathering enough small pieces of information that the overall picture eventually revealed itself. That was exactly what the committee was doing. Nobody searched for a single decisive piece of evidence. Instead, they collected facts, patiently, methodically. One evening, while reviewing notes at home, Frank found himself staring at a map spread across his dining room table. Several versions of the shoreline had accumulated over the decades, each showing subtle differences. Wetlands expanded and contracted. Water channels shifted. Flood-prone areas changed shape. Looking at a single map revealed very little. Looking at all of them together revealed a landscape that was far more dynamic than the development company's promotional material suggested. The realization reminded him of something Evelyn had said during one of their meetings. The land remembers things people forget. At the time, Frank had assumed she was being poetic. Now he understood she had been entirely practical. Places carried histories. Water followed old paths. Infrastructure inherited previous decisions. Communities accumulated consequences. Ignoring those realities rarely ended well. As September progressed, committee members began focusing on areas that reflected their individual expertise. Walter Pike examined engineering plans. Howard Bell reviewed financial assumptions. Ruth Carmichael spoke with residents and community groups. Evelyn continued digging through historical records with the determination of an archaeologist excavating a lost civilization. Frank naturally gravitated toward the numbers. The development company had published projections regarding infrastructure costs, population growth, tax revenue, and long-term economic benefits. On the surface, the figures appeared reasonable. They had certainly been prepared by competent professionals. Yet something about them bothered him. Not because they were inaccurate, because they were optimistic. There was a difference. Over the years, Frank had learned that forecasts often reflected what people hoped would happen rather than what was most likely to happen. Optimism was not dishonesty. In many cases, it was simply human nature. People preferred positive scenarios. Investors preferred positive scenarios. Developers certainly preferred positive scenarios. The challenge was that reality did not always cooperate. After several weeks of analysis, Frank prepared a series of alternative projections based on more conservative assumptions. The results weren't catastrophic. The project did not suddenly become impossible. It simply became riskier, more expensive, more uncertain. The distinction mattered. One evening he presented his findings during a committee meeting. The church basement looked much as it always did. Folding tables, coffee cups, homemade baking, the familiar collection of retirees whose combined experience now seemed almost impossible to measure. As Frank walked through the numbers, he noticed something interesting. Nobody appeared surprised. The details were new. The conclusion was not. Years of experience had taught these people how to recognize optimism disguised as certainty. The discussion that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Ideas moved around the room. Questions generated additional questions. Observations connected with historical records. Financial concerns connected with engineering concerns. Community concerns connected with environmental concerns. Frank found himself smiling several times throughout the evening. Not because the situation was improving, because the process itself was remarkable. The committee functioned the way many organizations claimed to function but rarely did. People listened. They changed their minds when presented with evidence. They acknowledged uncertainty. Nobody seemed interested in winning arguments. The goal was understanding. That alone felt refreshingly rare. The most important breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. Several days later, Evelyn contacted Frank and asked him to stop by her house. The request immediately suggested one of two possibilities. Either she had discovered something significant, or she had found additional boxes of historical documents. As it turned out, both were true. Evelyn lived in a modest house filled with books, maps, photographs, and enough filing cabinets to support a small archive. Frank suspected she possessed records documenting virtually every important decision the town had made during the last half-century. That afternoon, she led him toward a dining room table covered with photographs. Most were old aerial images. Some dated back decades. Several showed the exact section of shoreline under consideration for development. At first glance, the images seemed unremarkable. Then, Evelyn began placing them in chronological order. The pattern became obvious almost immediately. The wetlands were larger than current planning documents indicated, considerably larger. Seasonal flooding extended farther inland than many modern assessments suggested. Several drainage channels had gradually disappeared from recent maps despite remaining visible in older records. Frank studied the photographs carefully. Then he studied them again. A feeling he recognized from countless audits began emerging. The feeling that important information had been overlooked. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply overlooked. The distinction mattered. People often imagined that major mistakes resulted from corruption or deception. In Frank's experience, most problems arose from something far more ordinary: incomplete information, assumptions, oversights, memory fading over time. The next public meeting attracted one of the largest crowds in recent memory. Residents filled the community center. Additional chairs were required. Conversations echoed through hallways and gathering spaces. The atmosphere remained civil, but tension had clearly increased. By now the committee had assembled a substantial body of information, not a campaign, not an opposition movement. Information, historical records, financial analysis, environmental observations, infrastructure concerns. The presentation that evening lasted nearly 3 hours. What impressed Frank most was how the committee approached the situation. Nobody attempted to dominate the discussion. Nobody delivered emotional speeches. Nobody portrayed developers as villains. Instead, they shared facts. Questions were raised. Documents were presented. Historical photographs appeared. Alternative projections were reviewed. The cumulative effect proved powerful. Not because any single revelation changed minds, because dozens of small observations gradually created a more complete picture. As Frank watched residents absorb the information, he found himself reflecting on one of the committee's unwritten principles. Problems become easier to solve when people understand them. The principle sounded obvious. Yet much of modern life seemed dedicated to doing the opposite. Complicated issues were reduced to slogans. Nuance disappeared. People chose sides before gathering information. The committee operated differently. Understanding came first. Conclusions came later. When the meeting finally ended, groups of residents remained behind discussing what they had heard. Some continued supporting the development. Others became more skeptical. Most occupied a position somewhere in between. Frank considered that a success. Communities did not need unanimous agreement. They needed informed decisions. As he walked toward his car, Walter Pike joined him. The parking lot was nearly full. Evening air carried the first hints of approaching autumn. Across the street, leaves had already begun changing color. For a while, neither man spoke. Then Walter looked back toward the community center. "Not bad." Frank smiled. "Not bad at all." What neither man mentioned was how much work had occurred behind the scenes to reach that point. Hundreds of hours. Decades of accumulated experience. Countless conversations. Endless pieces of information gathered, preserved, remembered, and shared. The public meeting appeared spontaneous. It was anything but. It represented the collective effort of people who cared enough to pay attention. Driving home that evening, Frank found himself thinking once again about the name. The Committee for Normal Things. The title still sounded slightly ridiculous. Yet perhaps that was part of its brilliance. Because when stripped of all complexity, the committee existed to protect ordinary things: functional infrastructure, accurate information, community memory, thoughtful decision-making, the quiet foundations that allowed normal life to continue. Those things rarely attracted attention, until they disappeared. The development proposal had revealed something important about the committee. The members were not simply volunteers, they were stewards. Caretakers of knowledge that might otherwise be lost. And as autumn settled over the town, Frank began to suspect that their efforts were having an effect. The outcome remained uncertain. The final decision had not yet been made. Yet for the first time, the community was seeing the full picture. For the committee, that had always been the goal. Not controlling decisions, helping people make better ones. And in Frank's experience, organized common sense was often far more powerful than people realized. Chapter 10. By the time the final council meeting arrived, the proposed shoreline development had stopped being a simple argument between growth and preservation, which was precisely what Frank Bickerstaff had come to appreciate about the Committee for Normal Things. They had not defeated the proposal by shouting over it, nor had they saved the town through outrage, spectacle, or dramatic accusations. They had done something slower and more useful. They had made the issue more honest. Over several months, they had taken a polished version of the future and placed it beside maps, photographs, cost projections, drainage records, historical reports, and the living memory of people who had watched the shoreline change over half a century. What remained was no longer a sales pitch. It was a decision. The meeting was held in the same community center where Frank had once stood among display boards, studying cheerful drawings of people walking dogs beside buildings that did not yet exist. That earlier version of the project had seemed almost weightless, floating above the real world in soft colors and optimistic assumptions. Now the room felt different. The crowd was larger, quieter, and more attentive. People had come not merely to support or oppose something, but to understand what they were being asked to accept. Frank took a seat near the back, not with the committee exactly, because the committee rarely sat together in public, but close enough that he could see Walter Pike leaning against the wall near the side entrance, Evelyn Marsh arranging several folders on her lap, Ruth Carmichael speaking softly with two former students who were now parents themselves, and Howard Bell examining the agenda with the grave expression of a man who had never trusted agendas. The discussion lasted a long time, though later Frank would remember less about the speeches than the atmosphere. There were developers who spoke professionally and confidently, council members who asked careful questions, residents who supported the project because the town needed housing, and residents who worried that the price of moving too quickly might not become clear until it was too late. What impressed Frank was that the conversation never quite collapsed into the usual performance. The facts gathered by the committee had changed the shape of the debate. People could still disagree, and they did, but they were disagreeing inside a fuller picture. The wetlands could no longer be treated as an inconvenience hidden behind attractive landscaping. Infrastructure costs could no longer be discussed as though every optimistic assumption would come true. The old drainage channels, visible in Evelyn's photographs and confirmed by Walter's analysis, had become part of the town's memory again. When council finally voted, the decision was neither as dramatic nor as clean as Doris McPhee would later describe it. The development was not destroyed. The company was not exposed as villainous. No one was escorted from the room. Instead, the proposal was deferred pending a full independent review, a revised environmental assessment, updated infrastructure costing, and binding guarantees regarding public shoreline access. To some residents, it felt like a victory, to others like a delay, and to the developers it clearly felt like a costly complication. To Frank, it felt like something rarer and more valuable than victory. It felt like the town had given itself time to think. Afterward, people lingered in the parking lot beneath the yellow glow of the community center lights. Autumn had settled properly over the town by then, and the night air carried that mixture of damp leaves, cooling pavement, and distant wood smoke that always made Frank think of school years long past. Doris found him near his car, triumphant in the manner of someone whose original theory had been wrong in nearly every detail, but somehow correct in spirit. She informed him that she had known all along the town was being influenced by a secret organization, and Frank, who had learned there was no practical benefit in arguing with Doris when she was enjoying herself, merely nodded and said she had certainly noticed something important. Walter joined them a few minutes later, and for a while the three of them stood watching people drift toward their cars. No one thanked the committee because almost no one understood what the committee had done. A few residents thanked Evelyn for the photographs. Someone complimented Walter on his engineering notes. Ruth received a hug from a woman whose daughter had once been one of her students. Howard accepted a handshake and looked embarrassed by it. The town would remember the meeting as a public process that had produced a more cautious decision, which was true enough. The deeper truth, the one Frank now understood, was that caution had been made possible by people who had spent years quietly keeping track of things others forgot. Driving home along the shoreline, Frank felt an unfamiliar contentment. It was not the excitement he had felt in the early days of the investigation, when Doris's folder first opened a door into an absurd and intriguing mystery. It was steadier than that. The case, if it could be called a case, had not made him rich, famous, or even particularly important. What it had done was return him to usefulness. He had contributed something. Not everything, not even the most important thing, but something real. His spreadsheets had mattered. His questions had mattered. His old professional habits, which he had assumed belonged to the life he had left behind, had found a new place in the world. Several weeks later, the committee held its usual meeting in the basement of St. Andrew's Church. There was no celebration on the agenda, though someone brought 2 pies, and Howard claimed that any gathering involving more than 1 pie qualified as an event. The shoreline project was discussed for less than 10 minutes, mostly as a matter requiring continued monitoring, because no one in the room believed that complicated problems disappeared simply because a meeting had gone well. After that, attention moved to other concerns: a volunteer shortage at the food bank, drainage near the soccer fields, a badly designed intersection near the new pharmacy, and a rumor that the library's winter reading program needed help finding funding. Frank sat with his laptop open, making notes while conversations flowed around him. He no longer felt like a visitor. The change had happened so gradually that there had been no moment to mark it. No invitation. No vote. No announcement. He had simply become someone who was expected to be there, which was perhaps the most meaningful form of membership the committee offered. At one point, Walter asked whether the project tracker had room for another category, and Evelyn suggested that Frank should create a section for historical records before everyone forgot where they had put them. Frank made a note of it, then noticed Doris watching him from across the room with an expression of unbearable satisfaction. When the meeting ended, Walter remained behind to help stack chairs while Frank packed away his laptop. The church basement was quieter now, with only the smell of coffee and the scrape of chair legs lingering in the air. Walter said, almost casually, that people were pleased Frank had stayed. Frank pretended to misunderstand, as he often did when conversations wandered too close to sincerity. But Walter merely smiled and continued stacking chairs until the silence made avoidance impossible. Eventually, Frank admitted that he was pleased too, and the admission felt oddly larger than the words themselves. Winter approached slowly after that. The lake grew darker. Tourists disappeared. Morning frost appeared on windshields. Frank's days settled into a rhythm that seemed ordinary from the outside and quietly remarkable from within. He still lived alone in the same house. He still drank coffee at the same kitchen table. He still took walks through town and noticed things other people missed. Yet the loneliness that had once gathered around those routines had thinned. His life had acquired connections. Doris called too often. Walter occasionally stopped by unannounced. Evelyn began sending him historical documents with instructions that were phrased as suggestions but clearly were not. People waved to him differently now, though Frank suspected he was imagining that part. The town continued being the town. Streetlights failed. Volunteers forgot things. Budgets tightened. Storm drains clogged. Residents complained. Geese maintained a level of confidence Frank considered excessive. Nothing had been perfected, and no one inside the committee believed perfection was possible. That, perhaps, was what Frank found most comforting. The Committee for Normal Things was not trying to create a flawless community. It was trying to keep ordinary life from becoming unnecessarily difficult, and there was something deeply humane in the modesty of that ambition. One cold evening in late November, Frank arrived at St. Andrew's to find the basement already warm with conversation. Coffee steamed in paper cups. Someone had brought butter tarts. Howard was arguing that the new crosswalk timing near the pharmacy represented an insult to pedestrians. Ruth was making a list of volunteers for the food bank. Evelyn had spread 3 maps across a table and was explaining to anyone willing to listen that the town had made this exact drainage mistake in 1987. Frank removed his coat, opened his laptop, and felt, with some surprise, that he had come home to something. Near the end of the meeting, after most of the practical business had been addressed, Doris raised her hand. This was unnecessary, since the committee did not follow parliamentary procedure unless someone wished to irritate Walter, but Doris raised it anyway. She announced that she had identified a new issue requiring investigation. Several members smiled. Frank felt a familiar sense of foreboding. Doris explained that the local weather forecasts had become suspiciously inaccurate on Thursdays, specifically Thursdays, and that she had reason to believe someone was influencing them for reasons not yet understood. The room received this with the mixture of patience and amusement Doris had earned over time. Howard asked whether weather had ever been reliably accurate on any day. Ruth suggested there might be a simpler explanation. Walter muttered something about lake effect systems. Evelyn, however, looked thoughtful, which was always dangerous. Frank waited for the matter to dissolve into harmless speculation. It did not. After a moment, Evelyn said that she had noticed something odd about the Thursday forecasts too. The room grew just a little quieter. Doris turned toward Frank with the expression of a woman who had just been handed a crown. Frank looked around the basement at the retired engineer, the former librarian, the insurance adjuster, the administrator, the teachers, the planners, the practical citizens who had somehow become the most effective unofficial organization in town. He thought about the man he had been at the beginning of spring, sitting alone beside the lake, believing retirement meant the gradual disappearance of responsibility. Then he thought about the man he had become, which was apparently the sort of man who investigated suspicious weather patterns with a group of highly organized retirees. He closed his laptop, opened it again, and created a new file. Doris leaned across the table and whispered, with theatrical seriousness, "You see? I told you they were controlling things." Frank smiled, typed the words Thursday forecast issue at the top of the page, and said that they had better start with the data. Outside, the first snow of the season began falling softly over the town, covering sidewalks, rooftops, benches, church steps, parking lots, and the quiet shoreline where the postponed development would one day either be revised properly or not built at all. By morning, residents would wake to the ordinary inconveniences of winter. Driveways would need shoveling, roads would need sanding, someone would complain about plowing, someone else would organize help for neighbors who couldn't manage their walks. And somewhere in town, before most people noticed anything needed doing, the Committee for Normal Things would already be paying attention. That, Frank had come to understand, was the most dangerous thing in town. Not power, not secrecy, not influence. Competence, organized gently, aimed toward the common good. And Frank Bickerstaff, retired accountant, lifelong skeptic, reluctant joiner of groups, and now unofficial investigator of the quietly improbable, had finally found a conspiracy worth belonging to.